ThreatLocker is a global cybersecurity leader paving the way for businesses everywhere to implement a zero-trust security solution that not only protects business-critical data, but also helps mitigate cyber attacks. ThreatLocker's unique endpoint solutions help you to work smart and strengthen your security infrastructure from the ground up. ThreatLocker's allow listing, ring fencing, storage control, elevation control, and network access control solutions give you a more secure approach to blocking the exploits of unknown application vulnerabilities. If you're looking to enhance your cybersecurity and stop zero-day vulnerabilities exploiting your data, reach out to a ThreatLocker cyber hero today. Visit securityweekly.com/ThreatLocker to learn more. Your organization is building and updating business-critical web applications faster than ever. And with so much pressure to move fast, you may find yourself making trade-offs between innovation and security. Now you can build fast without sacrificing security with Invicti, the application security platform that helps your dev, sec, and ops teams work together to secure every website, web app, and API. With unparalleled accuracy, coverage, and automation, Invicti scales like no other AppSec solution. Discover why many of the world's largest organizations innovate securely with Invicti. Visit securityweekly.com/Invicti. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Doug Dooley about building empathy between DevOps and AppSec teams in order to create a secure cloud environment. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella and Joe South, and it's just about time for the news. But first, Security Weekly listeners save 20% on InfoSec World 2022 passes. InfoSec World will be held September 27th through the 29th at Disney's Coronado Springs Resort in Lake Buena Vista, Florida. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW and secure your spot with the code ISW22-SecWeek20. Plus, don't miss any of your favorite Security Weekly content. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to any of our podcast feeds and have all new episodes downloaded right to your phone. You can also join our mailing list, Discord server, and follow us on social media and our streaming platforms. And this, John and Joe, brings us to a pretty eventful week in the news. And here I am not even slyly alluding to Twitter news. So I know we've got a bunch of articles to go through, but there's a bit of a Rorschach blot aspect to the Twitter whistleblower report that I want to test with you two to see what your responses are. But it's also a pretty complex issue, so I figured I would break it down into a simple limerick for our listeners. So if you're unfamiliar with Twitter, there was a hacker named Mudge blew the whistle, causing Twitter execs to bristle. He said they were lacking protection from hacking, and they replied, "Here's your dismissal." So I think that sums up the environment for me. John, your turn. Give us your take on the whole Twitter disaster.
Man, I wish I would have put one together for that if I had known. That's no fair at all. Yeah, my limerick funny is not working right now. It's no. You know, the general consensus I think amongst most of us is going to be, who are you going to believe, a Twitter exec or Mudge? It's pretty obvious to me.
No, indeed. I think there's an aspect of it. There's probably four broad categories. I'd break down the 120 or so points that are in the report to. There's an aspect of bots that, honestly, I don't think that's very interesting for us to talk about. Let's skip that. There's insider threats, which is interesting, but not necessarily fully AppSec related, although we could talk a little bit about least privilege access and things like that. Then there's user endpoint security, which was a bit surprising when you get to some statistics like 30% of users just turning off security. Not a good look. And then there's a bunch of aspects of secure SDLC. And those, I think, maybe are some areas to touch on a little bit. And one in the case of just, let's take a surprise temperature. I'm not sure. We'll have to work on this. We need a new Kinsella scale for surprise for my co-host here. If we say in the report, over 50% of Twitter's 500,000 data center servers were non-compliant, or we didn't have kernels or operating systems that were upgraded to either whatever their compliance level was, whatever their desired baseline was, or didn't support encryption at rest. Now, I want to navigate some cynicism, some perfect security that you alluded to in our last segment, guys. What's your response just to this? Half of our 500,000 servers are are behind under baseline.
It's a nice tie-in to the previous half. Honestly, it's where Twitter's a new company for all intents and purposes. 15 years, somewhere around there. It's a new company. They're not, ain't nobody naming servers over there, right? It's so everything they're doing should be fairly automated. So it's definitely a cattle not pets type thing. So I am surprised. I'll say moderately Kinsella surprised that that should just be taken care of automatically. So from that point of view, I'm surprised. From a point of view of, it seems like there's a lot of issues around, they were sort of the I'll say the brother to, when we quote, move fast and break things, people usually attribute that to Facebook. But I think Twitter was doing a pretty good amount. I mean, Twitter was moving as fast as they possibly could in the early day, right? They couldn't keep their service up. It was, when there was like government issues around the world, Twitter was what was allowing people to communicate, and they were really at the edge of their limits trying to just allow people to talk. So I get that. But it feels like over time, did people go back and really clean up? I'm guessing that's partially what happened there. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting thinking about. We focus on AppSec, but a lot of this still is, while as Doug was saying the last bit, underneath that, whatever that cloud service you're using, that's someone else's problem. But if you're trying to really maximize your scale and you're owning the servers or using EC2 instances, whatever, that's your problem. So what were they doing there is the question, and we've got to do a little foreshadowing. We've got another story talking about you can have perfect security in your AppSec. But something else can come along and cause issues if you're not careful.
Yeah, excellent point that there's a lot of things to pay attention to there. I think for me, that 500,000 number is pretty big, and there's probably maybe a dozen or so organizations out there that have that magnitude of scale to deal with. But honestly, the problem doesn't sound unique. I'm going to guess it's not unique to Twitter, that there's a lot of organizations out there, even with orders of magnitudes, call it 50,000, even 5,000 servers, they're just having trouble. If they're in the data center, what's the time it takes just to physically reboot those if they need to be rebooted for a kernel upgrade? Or if you are running them in containerized or in EC2 instances, for example, that's just a lot. That's going to demand automation. I think that, as you pointed out, that ties in, I think, pretty well with our discussion with Doug in the last segment. Don't know, Joe, if there's anything else that surprises you about that number, or sort of if you had maybe a magic wand and you wish things could be better, that you'd love to see organizations never have to worry about a particular issue like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a situation where I think in the beginning they were just trying to move as quickly as possible, and they didn't, focus so much on security. And so now we're in this situation where we're trying to, backpedal and go through things and kind of bootstrap in this security while the company is still fairly rapidly growing. I'm sure their infrastructure is growing, several times over, every couple of years, right? And so when you're growing at that pace and you don't already have good security principles in place in your environment, it makes things very difficult. Even just decommissioning accounts or trying to have a least privileged, framework in your environment becomes close to impossible. And so, Twitter came into this, Jack Dorsey came into this, right, where he didn't expect this company to be this big or this platform to be this big, and it is now. And so now they're dealing with a problem that they never thought that would even exist, and they're dealing with it, how any company would in that situation.
I guess the one thing to mention to our, I'll say slightly on the junior side listeners, is if you're working on something at either a large company or small company, startup or even a college project, and you're like, oh, we just need to get this out the door, we're going to come back and secure it. Here's example A or exhibit A of that's not going to happen. any of us will say it. I still say it in my current jobs. Like, we'll get to that next week. We just need to get this done and get a customer signed up. The chance of you getting back to it, man, it's just so difficult. So when those words come out of your mouth, realize that there's a pretty good chance that you're someone's going to be quoting you on it in the future. Hopefully not a situation like this, but yeah, it's really tough to come back and find the space to do this stuff and clean up. So it's a balance, right?
It is tough.
Well, last thought, you don't want to over-engineer, but that's the balance. Go ahead.
No, I was going to you make a great point, because it is tough, but it is not impossible to come back and fix some of your code, because John, some 80-year-old dude went and fixed awk. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, so I started snarkily, I don't know why I'm looking for the tab. I snarkily commented the title on this. Some 80-year-old dude went and put a patch into awk, so it would support Unicode. That 80-year-old dude being Brian Kerrigan, the guy who wrote not just awk, but like the K and KNR C and so many other amazing things. Yeah, so I guess this actually happened. It's not merged. I was looking at it earlier. It's on a separate branch. I don't know why. But if you go out to GitHub, you'll see it on a. Do I have the tab? I do. It's in our show notes, obviously. But why can I not find it? I must have closed it. But anyway, so he was always, I guess, well, there was a quote in an interview where this sort of came to light, because it's not in his actual name. It's someone else did the actual commit, but they said BWK did it. But yeah, awk, the command line text editor, which some of us use out there still, didn't support Unicode, right? It was a good old standard C code that was good for, a char, and that was it. So he's gone through and done a PR to allow that to have Unicode support. So, man, I hope in another, 30-ish years, I'm able to still be doing pull requests and also doing something like some code that I wrote 30 years ago is still, who am I kidding, 30? Probably 50 years ago, is still being used. And actually, I'm going to update it for the new communication technology people are using. That'd be a pretty amazing place to be in. So kudos to him, and sort of cool to see he's still doing stuff.
Absolutely, kudos to see. And that sets up, I'm going to jump forward to one of the other articles I grabbed. I love to look back to the past. You may have noticed a few of my movie references, music, etc. But there are some AppSec items as well. And this week is the 31st anniversary, I believe, of Nmap. Quite a venerable tool. I think not quite as old as awk, but it's definitely up there. But there are some cool aspects of Nmap. That one is just, I linked to the FRAC article in the show notes. And in that ASCII article, you have the full source code to the very first release of Nmap. But one of my questions about this too, to bring this into the modern era, is that awk, one of John's go-to tools, as he mentioned. I've honestly never used it myself that often. I always went with Perl or grep. So grep is one of my tools that stands the test of time. But if we were to talk to new folks coming into just IT, into development, into security, what are some of those command line tools that you would point them to, that these are really good to know? And as an example, and I'm possibly stealing the thunder before you guys get to answer, curl and JQ would be two of mine that I'd go with. Curl, of course, being an easy way just to take a look at a website. And JQ making JSON actually readable by humans, which that was a great revelation for me. So is there a command line or two that you think people should really know?
I'm ready for this one. So I was just looking last week. There was some sort of snarky Medium post out there. Maybe I'll add it into show notes. Medium post called "You're Missing Out on the Best Terminal Experience," and it goes through a bunch of sort of snarky how to update and sort of bejazzle your terminal, so to speak. But some of the things he mentions is, I guess the kids nowadays out there, are rewriting some of the Unix tools in Rust. So one example being Zoxide, Zoxide, which is a modern day replacement for CD. And then that also linked out to a post from Julie Evans, who I believe we've talked about in the past, who has a list of newish command line tools. 3 replacements for grep, 2 for ls, mosh I use for SSH, bat instead of cat, delta is a pager for git, ft for find. And a lot of these really come down to, as we have more power at a CLI, how do you navigate quicker, right? So can you either display things quicker as you're looking at, or display things in a more manageable way as you're looking at them. Like if you do git diff, you get this pile of, not junk, right? But you need a pager on it. And the ability to change directories, if you have either some sort of memory buffer or command completion to be able to say, hey, these are 5 directories I've been in recently, let me sort of autocomplete or suggest those. So it's some things like that. Looks like there's a modern day version of sed. I don't see one for awk. There's one for du. But anyways, we'll add this into the list. I don't know, Joe, if you've got any favorites or if any of these have reminded you of one to use.
What's the different version of sed that you just mentioned?
The different version of sed is SD.
Huh.
It's got 3,600 stars on GitHub, so someone's using it.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I'm not very interesting in this area, but things like grep, things like grep really kind of changed how I interacted with a command line based system. I would say it's not necessarily a command line utility, but SE Linux is a great a great security tool for anyone that's already familiar with command line.
Man,
that we already mentioned.
Half of our listeners just stopped playing the episode after you mentioned that.
Oh. I liked it when I used it 10 years ago.
I'm just teasing. I'm a fan of it too.
Oh, that's wonderful. So I'll use that just to throw in August 1991. Linus Torvalds posted about his new project called Linux. Obviously, there was no SE at the time, and this is just more of a fun look back at the current month we're in. But one of the things that was really neat about his announcement that I linked to is that it'll probably never will support anything other than AT hard disks. But lo and behold, they supports eBPF, SE Linux, many other things, as well as if you're a follower of the some anthropology of tech, there's a Windows subsystem for Linux, no less. So you can run Linux natively, effectively, on not in a virtual machine on Microsoft. So that's pretty fun to see. So if we're talking about command lines and tools, probably just some knowledge of pick your shell, but a knowledge of some basic navigating around a Linux system is probably effective as well. And I'm quite sure that Julia Evans has some zines about that as well. So we'll have to update our show notes, throw some of those in, because those are much more entertaining than some dry ASCII blog pages. But John, you also mentioned perfect versus good. And this is something we also talked about with Tanya Jenka a couple of weeks ago. And I think there is you can have a great security code review, but possibly fall down and stumble in some other situations in your environment. Tell us more.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. We found another dfly exploit. Acala, I'm guessing it's pronounced, ACLA, was a new crypto platform, came out, was launched in I think the 13th of August, so about, 2 weeks ago. And they did all the right things, right? So they even had Trailabits, who we've had on the show before, and a few other, very well-known providers go through and do code audits. I'm looking for one of the names of the other guys and not just focus on TOB. But they had a few of them come through and take a look-see at this and give it the thumbs up. But as you can imagine, these systems are modern and complex, right? So you're going to have with any type of trading platform for the last, probably for forever, but definitely for the last 20 years, you have what's called a liquidity pool. So that allows you to, instead of having to get the cash from someone or the maybe not cash, but instead of having to get the currency from one to do a trade and then get it to the other person, you keep a liquidity pool, and that allows you to be able to do those transactions faster. So the coins have things like this. In this particular story, you don't want to write these things, right? This is how any modern startup or modern anything, we don't write these, we don't have to. So they were using a liquidity pool, or at least one of the ones they were using was called, begins with a H-O. Hanzon protocol. And it turns out while they did a really good job doing the code review on their code base, there was a misconfiguration of how Hanzon protocol was set up. So shortly after the coin went live, and they got people to contribute a bunch of money into or other coins into it to create that liquidity pool, the hacker kids came along. I should say the miscreants came along, and realized that they were able to mint coins within the pool, and they did so to the effect of $1.3 billion dollars, or equivalents thereof. So everyone found it fairly quickly. It turns out this is being DeFi. Even the decision to stop the trading in the pool was also a distributed vote. But they've managed to write most of it. They've cleaned up a lot, then they've written off a lot of it with another vote. But just it comes down to that, as we were saying before. You can have perfect code, but if there's an ability for a configuration to be incorrect, and people are now saying, hey, maybe the protocol itself should have been written so that this misconfiguration couldn't have been allowed to be possible. Maybe not. But the point, at least for me, is you got to look at everything. You can't just look at your code. If you're sitting on a server, what's the state of the server? If you've got configurations, how are those set up? What's your checks and balances on those? So there's always ways to improve, and these guys found that the hard way.
Found the hard way, and once again, the self-funding bug bounty strikes again within the DeFi environment. You mentioned too the protocol aspect. I for one of the reasons I picked out that Nmap article is that Nmap was also a way of looking at protocols, specifically TCP, TCP/IP, UDP, and is really interesting to me, at least, hopefully to others as I share this, of how can you manipulate, abuse, or make surprising use of protocols to do port scanning. Everything from very old school FTP bounces that don't exist anymore to just understanding different types of, I was going to have a trivia contest between you, Joe, and John about, I was going to name a Nmap flag, and you had to figure out what type of scan mode it put into, but that seemed a little too mean. But one of the things I was just trying to point there is that reading through protocols, doing protocol analysis can be pretty rich if you discover an attack surface or tooling. And I'm using this as a callback to Portswigger's work on HTTP desync work and request smuggling, looking at HTTP 1.1. And I think I have a loose segue here to connect this to Fisher, some RF hacking, and sort of some analysis here. So, John, help me out. Did I make a reasonable connection to protocol and RF hacking for you?
I think you did a pretty good job there. I'll say as an aside, I was a fan of both SYN scans as well as Christmas scans. But so Fisher apparently it's doing, I guess, in the industry. In the restaurant industry, they'd call it a soft launch. They did a talk at DEF CON, which isn't really the softest of launches, but this article I got from Hackaday is saying that they're still sort of slowly actually releasing what this thing's capable of. But it's a new framework for using your software-defined radios for doing manipulation of RF protocols. So they've given a few examples or a few talks so far. One is they're playing with ADSB. This is a protocol used for general aviation as well as commercial to broadcast I don't want to say a plane, a flying object's location, because drones can use it too. So one example is how can you fuzz that protocol and use this library to do that. They had another one in there where they're playing with some of the stuff from Twitter. So it's basically another library to make some of these underlying things which some of us would want to do a little bit easier. So it looks like it's probably something we'll be talking about in the future. Again, it's my guess, but this is sort of first peek and first sort of people starting to play with it in public.
Oh, that's fun. Yeah, and I'm definitely going to have to dive into some more of that software-defined radio, because I've got any hams out there. I've got a Yaesu FT65 handheld, so I've been doing some old RF play myself. Now, I don't have a good segue into this article, but I did want to touch on another question for you too, and I'll start with Joe this time. We had a breach to cover from LastPass. And it looks like, everybody, maybe you don't have to change your passwords. I think, at least according to the breach response, which neither used, we take your security seriously or we take it with the utmost dedication, which is my two favorite bingo words now. But they did say LastPass hackers got access to portions of our source code. And I'm kind of curious, does that give you warm fuzzies, the opposite of warm fuzzies? As you can tell, I'm trying to figure out the Shima rating scale to compete with the Kinsella. Joe, what's your reaction to a company losing some of their source code?
Yeah, it's a bit alarming because, for a lot of people, that's the crown jewels, right? Like that's every password that you have for every site that you traffic, and they say, of course, that no passwords were stolen, that all of the vaults are encrypted. But I mean, if your source code was reachable, then do you really know if that's true? If maybe there's a key in that source code that you weren't aware of, even, that some developer may have put in there and completely forgot about it because he was testing something. I mean, who knows, right? And I'm really interested to learn more about how they actually have architected this solution to be resilient to things like this. So like if you give someone literally the production code of LastPass, are they able to somehow retrieve my vault, my encrypted vault, and use my current credentials?
I saw you nodding to this, John. Yeah, what's your reaction? Because I may fall. I may be the lone vote out here.
Interesting. Well, first I want to say I think we need to set up either a cafe press or a custom ink. I think we need to start working on a t-shirt shop. I really wouldn't mind having "We take your security seriously" on a t-shirt. It's possible that their code is clean and that they have, there's no hidden APIs or no sort of, special flags or things like that, or everything is actually, they've scrubbed it by now because this isn't the first time that they've been in Spotlight. The chance of that, I'll go out on a limb. I'll put a number on it. I'll say I expect there's a 40% chance that we're going to see a additional vulnerability disclosures as a result of the source code coming out. I'd love to get a look at it. So if anyone out there has it, ping me.
That's interesting. My reaction comes from the aspect of, one, it's good that we do have the transparency. As you both are pointing out, this might not be, what confidence does LastPass have, of course, in their observability? Can they confidently say we have logs where we can review access to other services, so we can say that there was no, unauthorized access other than to this source code? But I like to go back to that idea of Kirchhoff's principle in the sense that having access to the source code shouldn't, weaken the protocol, weaken this system, or put users at risk. Obviously, as Joe points out, there could be hard-coded credentials. One hopes, fingers crossed, that that's not the case. I would build the parallel, though, to something like Signal, which can be built on open source tooling, open source code that anyone can review, but the security comes from the end-to-end security model and how the keys are managed. And with LastPass, we are putting a lot of trust, of course, in the end-to-end security model, that the keys are well managed on the client, that there are not any type of interception. I'll use the scary word of escrow keys as part of this, or types of other weaknesses in the design, which would be shown in the source code. But for me, I guess I was less concerned about the loss of source code, but I will agree that we would want to know that was there access to anything that were the secret vaults, or anything that manage HSMs, or something that's managing the password, the master passwords for these systems. But in any case, I guess I would say, whenever possible, dear users, use WebAuthn and throw that FIDO2 security key onto your authentication flow as well. So we got a couple other articles I want to jump to real quick. And one is, speaking of Linux, there's once again, Dirty Cred, an old 8-year-old vuln. So we've seen a couple of these old vulns before. So speaking of people with access to source code, finally saying, this code doesn't look right. This is, we should probably fix this. John, this was one of yours, so you'll have to. This is listeners. This is a secret. I throw over to John so that I can go then and finish skimming through the article while he fills us in.
Can't give away all our secrets.
No,
source code and the secrets.
We never do that.
So this one, it's not. I'm surprised it didn't get a little more attention. CVSS 7.8, according to the Red Hat customer portal, is where the CVE link took me. CVE 2022-2588. That seems short. I thought CVEs were more than 4 digits. Now maybe they're just missing some zeros. Anyways, and what's going on here is they figured out a way to do kernel credential swaps in such a way that the after swap, a application which should not be able to get access to the previous process's credentials is able to get access to them. In full disclosure, I was not quite familiar with what kernel credentials are, so I had to go and do a little bit of the Googling. Or let's be honest, I clicked on the link in the article. And what they're referring to here is something which has been around for a while, which is if you think about, as part of any process, you have it could be just the owner and group and IDs like that. It could be your SC Linux components. It could be there was some other things in here, and I got the tab, and it's gone away already. So these are applied to a task inode's message queue. So a lot of different structures have these in there. In some of the examples, as I mentioned, unit credentials, capabilities, if you're using capabilities for, especially on the Docker side of things, secure management flags and secure bits, keys and keyrings, LSM. So it's used in a lot of different ways. That's what they're bundling underneath the phrase kernel credentials. So it's a lot of stuff, right? And what the guys over, I believe it was Northwestern, if I remember right, University. Try to give credit to the right people. But anyways, they...
Yeah, it was Northwestern.
Thank you. They figured out a way to, if you're able to swap those to free an existing set of credentials, it's basically use after free in a way, the way I think of it, or at least the way I understand it. And then swap in your process to be able to use that same space, you now have the privileges and credentials and whatever those keys were from that previous process. So yeah, not that great on the Kinsella scale. I don't know. So that's it. It sounds like something could be fairly nasty, but my guessing is how the exploitability of it is not that great. But that's sort of my view. Hopefully that's giving you some time, Mike, to take a look, or Joe, if you have any comments.
Yeah, I kind of wonder how this wasn't discovered before. Maybe it wasn't used in the wild, or maybe it wasn't used in the wild enough to raise any flags with anything. I'm always confused as to how these, vulnerabilities from 8, 10, 12 years ago pop up now,
Yeah, it's amazing to see the diligence that researchers will put into just diving in with a fundamental understanding of an area of code, and then just saying, well, what if we do this? What if this? And I think one of the things that would be really interesting would be, how often are these things discovered through that just time? There is a week, a month, a rough time frame of this certain time frame is just understanding. Now you have the follow on of, what if scenarios, and then another time slot of toying around, playing with it to see if you can develop an exploit. And the reason I'm thinking of that is that's comparing that to, how come, turning on address sanitizers, turning on, all those warning as errors from your compiler isn't catching some of these potential misuse. And here, just perhaps just a classic type of use after free bug. So the one other thing I guess I would say is, I guess the tooling compilers, possibly theirs is a great spot to fuzz. Speaking of fuzzing, one of my favorite things. But as the Linux kernel is looking to Rust, for example, for their device drivers and helping that attack surface, maybe there are some other candidates for security-sensitive capabilities that lend themselves a little bit more easily to a refactoring into Rust, because you want to avoid these types of situations. So I think that's the best insight I can add on to this one. And John just doesn't realize it, but he muted himself as he's adding additional information here. Yes,
I said these wonderful things. Now I got to remember them. No, so what I was saying was it's interesting to think about what you just said, because when we've covered and talked about this in the past, the aspect of what do you rewrite into a more secure language. We've usually thought about device drivers or things like that, right? So it's like the area where there's people fiddling with bits of data that could have external manipulation in ways which weren't expected. But you're not really thinking about that for this example or use after free in general. At least I wouldn't. So that, I guess where that would fall on the thought process, if I go through with it, is where that would fall on a prioritization scale, right? You'd first want to get some of the device drivers and those things. And then as you get bored on a Friday night and you're looking for something else to switch over to Rust, that's when you'd probably start working on something like this. Or at least that's my guesstimate on that.
Yeah, I'd be curious. The Open Source Software Security Foundation is investing a lot of money into hardening these areas. So be curious to see what next year, what their decision-making process will be for rewriting some of the new tools or some of the areas of code. Two other quick articles I want to jump on. One was why empathy is key to better threat modeling. I thought I didn't realize that would be a nice association with our segment with Doug, but it did tie in very well, because this particular article, very short, and it doesn't talk about threat modeling in terms of Stride or tools, etc. For me, just open a Google Doc. That's the best tool that we need for threat modeling. But this talks about engaging developers, engaging those DevOps folks through coaching, helping them understand what it is, collaboration, integration with their processes. So that is what really spoke to me, and why I like that particular one. So Joe, I'm not sure how often you do threat modeling on a weekly or monthly basis, but if there's anything you would throw into this mix.
That's a really good question. What I would throw into it is getting an understanding of the background behind why an org, a team, a person is doing something, or configuring something a certain way, right? Because that'll give you insight into how you can best approach that situation to make it the most productive. Because that first impression is actually very important in security, because people always have that kind of just that predetermined thought, right, or misconception around security professionals just saying no to everything, right, or being difficult to work with. I've been at several organizations where that was the case, and trying to break down those barriers right from the start, I have found always helps in this type of situation.
This is really interesting. I think Joe's right. But what's interesting about it to me is no, I don't mean that in a bad way. Wow, Joe's right.
That was a pause there.
This might be the first time I agree with Joe.
No, but I'm actually, the pause is I'm looking at the article, which is, and we're talking about empathy, and you talked about empathy, and I think that's spot on. Or you were describing empathy, but the 3 points which they mentioned aren't empathetic. It talks about coaching is in help your developer understand. That's not being empathetic. It talks about collaboration of getting them to understand the culture of the company. That's not being empathetic, or that's the integration one. And then collaboration is like a culture of collaboration begins with the company's leadership. Again, that's not empathy. So I'm a little confused. Again, for clarification, not by Joe. But anyways, I agree with the message, and I think the rest of the article takes it. But the 3 points there, I don't know, interesting. But I know we're short on time.
Yeah, it's a great point, and show your work. Yeah. That I think we'll just use that as a lesson in communication. That I agree. The headline makes sense, and we agree with it, but the article itself doesn't necessarily. It supports different things that are still positive, but doesn't dive into the empathy aspect. And I think we're running just at the little bit, maybe a lot bit over time. But talking about Mudge and Loft, for example, they in 1998 presented to the group presented to the Senate about BGP problems, specifically how they could essentially, in their words, turn off the internet in roughly 30 minutes. And John, you have not quite the equivalent modern day example, but I think an article that kind of touches on that security and political type of discussions. Tell us more.
Yeah, so I think when Peter and those guys covered it, I think they covered it in a pretty good way, and it's. I think my understanding is that's still a fairly significant problem on the internet, the BGP issue. There's not enough people doing encryption on that or key sharing. But anyways, there's another article here on The Hill, which is not a publication we usually cover on ASW or probably any Security Weekly show. It's a political
True.
Publication that, if I remember right, leans a little bit right. But anyways, the headline here, Mother of All Zero Days, Immortal Flaws in Semiconductor Chips. Dun, dun, dun. And it's written by two folks over at Amida, which is some sort of, what I can tell, a consulting company. But it's a lot of rabble-rousing around, while we have just, signed... The U.S. government has signed a bill to increase the funding of doing more CPU and microchip production and design in the U.S., there's not really much talk to the security side of it. So those two sentences I'm totally 100% agreement with. But it's just interesting. The reason I put it in here is to take a thinking, how do we get other people over to our side? I talk a lot about, management up, working, with other folks in the company. And this is sort of an example of how do people try to really scare politicians into spending more money on this type of thing. It's like it's an interesting way of doing this in a public sense. This is an opinion piece, by the way, but to get this out there and get people thinking about it. But really, they're not writing this for me. This is written for either political aides for senators and congressmen or for those folks themselves. And that's sort of what they're trying to do when they put a piece like this into The Hill. But interesting to see, I thought, so I threw it in there for that.
No, yeah, it's a great way to end it on a discussion about presenting to different audiences, obviously, and it's, that angle of communication we'd like to touch on. And Joe and John, speaking of ways to talk to various audiences, I'm going to propose we continue to do so through limericks because, John, I got one more for you. In the 90s, some hackers from Loft warned Congress that networks were too soft. Now, 2 decades later, the risk is much greater, and apparently Twitter just scoffed. And with that, I have to say thank you for suffering through that. John, Joe, thank you everyone for listening. Please subscribe, hit that like button, check out the show notes, and we will see you in 2 weeks. We'll have a week off next Monday on Application Security Weekly.